Well, good day, everyone, wherever you are. You're listening to Prophecy Reformation now. Today we're going to continue our reading of The History of Protestantism by James A. Wylie. We're in Volume 1, Book 2, and Chapter 7 is where we've ended up. So let's jump right in. Chapter 7. Persecution of Wickliffe by the Pope and the Hierarchy. Wycliffe's writings examined. His teachings submitted to the Pope. 3 bulls issued against him. Cited to appear before the Bishop of London. John of Gaunt accompanies him. Portrait of Wickliffe before his judges. Tumult. Altercation between Duke of Lancaster and Bishop of London. The mob rushes in. The court broken up. Death of Edward III. Meeting of Parliament. Wickliffe summoned to its councils. Question touching the papal revenue from English sees submitted to him. Its solution. England coming out of the house of bondage. The man who was the mainspring of a movement so formidable to the papacy must be struck down. The writings of Wickliffe were examined. It was no difficult matter to extract from his works doctrines which mutilated against the power and wealth of Rome. The Oxford professor had taught that the Pope was no more power than ordinary priests to excommunicate or absolve men, that neither bishop nor pope can validly excommunicate any man, unless by sin he has first made himself obnoxious to God, that princes cannot give endowments in perpetuity to the church, that when their gifts are abused, they have the right to recall them, and that Christ has given no temporal lordship to the popes, and no supremacy over kings. These propositions, called from the tracts of the Reformer, were sent to Pope Gregory XI. These doctrines were found to be of peculiarly bad odor at the papal court. They struck at a branch of the pontifical prerogative on which the holders of the tiara have always put a special value. If the world should come to be of Wycliffe's sentiments, farewell to the temporal power of the popes, the better half of their kingdom. The matter portended a terrible disaster to Rome, unless prevented in time. For broaching a similar doctrine, Arnold of Brescia had done expiation amid the flames. Wickliffe had been too long neglected. He must be immediately attended to. 3 separate bulls were drafted on the same day, May 22nd, 1377, and dispatched to England. These bulls hinted surprise at the weakness of the English clergy in not having before now crushed this formidable heresy which was springing up on their soil, and they commanded them no longer to delay, but to take immediate steps for silencing the author of that heresy. One of the bulls was addressed to Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, and William Courtenay, Bishop of London. The second was addressed to the king, and the third to the University of Oxford. They were all of the same tenor. The one addressed to the king dwelt on the greatness of England, as glorious in power and riches, but more illustrious for the piety of its faith, and for its using to shine with the brightness of the sacred page. The scriptures had not yet been translated into the vernacular tongue, and the papal compliment, which turns on this point, is scarcely intelligible. The university was commanded to take care that tares did not spring up among its wheat, and that from its chairs propositions were not taught, detestable and damnable, tending to subvert the state of the whole church and even the civil government. The bull addressed to the bishops was expressed in terms still more energetic. The Pope could not help wishing that the rector of Lutterworth and professor of divinity was not a master of errors, and had run into a kind of detestable wickedness. not only and openly publishing, but also vomiting out of the filthy dungeon of his breast divers professions, false and erroneous conclusions, and most wicked and damnable heresies, whereby he might defile the faithful sort, and bring them from the right path headlong into the way of perdition. They were therefore to apprehend the said John Wickliffe, and shut him up in prison, to send all proofs and evidences of his heresy to the Pope, taking care that the judgment was securely sealed and entrusted to a faithful messenger, and that meanwhile they should retain the prisoner in safe custody and await further instructions. Thus did Pope Gregory throw the wolves' hide over Wickliffe, that he might let slip his Dominicans in full cry upon his track. The zeal of the bishops anticipated the orders of the Pope. Before the bulls had arrived in England, the prosecution of Wickliffe was begun. At the instance of Courtenay, Bishop of London, Wickliffe was cited to appear on the 19th of February, 1377, in Our Lady's Chapel in St. Paul's, to answer for his teaching. The rumor of what was going on got wind in London, and when the day came, a great crowd assembled at the door of St. Paul's. Wickliffe, attended by two powerful friends, John, Duke of Lancaster, better known as John of Gaunt, and Lord Percy, Earl Marshal of England, appeared at the skirts of the assemblage. The Duke of Lancaster and Wickliffe had first met, it is probable, at Bruges, where it chanced both to be on a mission at the same time. Lancaster held the reformer in high esteem, on political, if not on religious grounds. Favoring his opinions, he resolved to go with him and show him countenance before the tribunal of the bishops. Here stood Wickliffe in the presence of his judges, a meagre form dressed in a long light mantle of black cloth, similar to those worn at this day by doctors, masters, and students in Cambridge and Oxford, with a girdle round the middle. His face, adorned with a long thick beard, showed sharp, bold features, a clear, piercing eye, firmly closed lips, which bespoke decision. His whole appearance full of great earnestness, significance, and character. But the three friends had found it no easy matter to elbow their way through the crowd. In forcing a passage, something like an uproar took place, which scandalized the court. Percy was the first to make his way into the chapel of Our Lady, where the clerical judges were assembled in their robes and insignia of office. "Percy," said Bishop Courtenay sharply, more offended, it is probable, at seeing the humble rector of Lutterworth so powerfully befriended than at the tumult which their entrance had created, "if I had known what mysteries you would have kept in the church, I would have stopped you from coming in hither." "He shall keep such mysteries," said John of Gaunt gruffly, "though you say nay." "Sit down, Wickliffe," said Percy, having but scant reverence for a court which owed its authority to a foreign power. "Sit down. You have many things to answer for, and have need to repose yourself on a soft seat." "He must and shall stand," said Courtenay, still more chafed. "It is unreasonable that one on trial before his ordinary should sit." "Lord Percy's proposal is but reasonable," imposed the Duke of Lancaster. "And as for you," he said, addressing Bishop Courtenay, "who are grown so arrogant and proud, I will bring down the pride not of you alone, but that of all the prelacy in England." To this menace the bishop calmly replied that his trust was in no friend on earth, but in God. This answer but the more inflamed the anger of the Duke, and the altercation became yet warmer, until at last John of Gaunt was heard to say that, rather than take such words from the bishop, he would drag him out of the court by the hair of the head. It is hard to say what the strife between the Duke and the bishop might have grown to, had no other parties suddenly appeared upon the scene. The crowd at the door, hearing what was going on within, burst the barrier, and precipitated itself en masse into the chapel. The angry contention between Lancaster and Courtenay was instantly drowned by the louder clamors of the mob. All was now confusion and uproar. The bishops had pictured to themselves the humble rector of Lutterworth standing meekly, if not tremblingly, at their bar. It was their turn to tremble. Their citation, like a dangerous spell which recoils on the man who uses it, had evoked a tempest which all their art and authority were not able to allay. To proceed with the trial was out of the question. The bishops hastily retreated. Wickliffe returned home. And so, says one, that council being broken up with scolding and brawling, was dissolved before 9 o'clock. The issues of the affair were favorable to the Reformation. The hierarchy had received a check, and the cause of Wycliffe began to be more widely discussed and better understood by the nation. At this juncture, events happened in high places which tended to shield the reformer and his opinions. Edward III, who had reigned with glory, but lived too long for his fame, now died, June 21st, 1377. His yet more renowned son, the Black Prince, had preceded him to the grave, leaving as heir to the throne a child of 11 years, who succeeded on his grandfather's death under the title of Richard II. His mother, the Dowager Princess of Wales, was a woman of spirit, friendly to the sentiments of Wickliffe, and not afraid, as we shall see, to avow them. The new sovereign, 2 months after his accession, assembled his first Parliament. It was composed of nearly the same men as the Good Parliament, which had passed such stringent edicts against the provisions and other usurpations of the Pope. The new Parliament was disposed to carry the war against the papacy a step further than its predecessor had done. It summoned Wycliffe to its councils. His influence was plainly growing. The trusted commissioner of princes, the counsellor of the parliaments, he had become a power in England. We do not wonder that the Pope singled him out as the man to be struck down. While the bulls which were meant to crush the reformer were still on their way to England, the Parliament unequivocally showed the confidence it had in his wisdom and integrity by submitting the following question to him: whether the kingdom of England might not lawfully, in case of necessity, detain and keep back the treasure of the kingdom for its defense, that it be not carried away to foreign and strange nations, the Pope himself demanding and requiring the same under pain of censure. This appears a very plain matter to us, but our ancestors of the 14th century found it encompassed with great difficulties. The best and bravest of England at that day were scared by the ghostly threat with which the Pope accompanied his demand, and they durst not refuse it until assured by Wickliffe that it was a matter in which the Pope had no right to command, and in which they incurred no sin and no danger by disobedience. Nothing could better show the thraldom in which our fathers were held, and the slow and laborious steps by which they found their way out of the house of their bondage. But out of what matter did the question now put to Wickliffe arise? It related to an affair which must have been peculiarly irritating to Englishmen. The popes were then enduring their Babylonian captivity, as they called their residence at Avignon. All through the reign of Edward III, the papacy, banished from Rome, had made its abode on the banks of the Rhone. One result of this was that each time the papal chair became vacant, it was filled with a Frenchman. The sympathies of the French Pope were, of course, with his native country. In the war now raging between France and England, it was natural to suppose that part at least of the treasure which the popes received from England went to the support of the war on the French side. Not only was the country drained of its wealth, but that wealth was turned against the country from which it was taken. Should this be longer endured? It was generally believed that at the moment the popes collectors had a large sum in their hands ready to send to Avignon to be employed, like that sent already to the same quarter, in paying soldiers to fight against England. Had they not better keep this gold at home? Wycliffe's reply was in the affirmative, and the grounds of his opinion were briefly and plainly stated. He did not argue the point on the canon law, or on the law of England, but on that of nature and the Bible. God, he said, had given to every society the power of self-preservation, and any power given by God to any society or nation may, without doubt, be used for the end for which it was given. This gold was England's own, and might unquestionably be retained for England's use and defense. But it might be objected, was not the Pope, as God's vicegerent, supreme proprietor of all the temporalities, of all the sees and religious corporations in Christendom? It was on the ground of his temporal supremacy that he demanded this money, and challenged England at its peril to retain it. But who, replied the Reformer, gave the Pope this temporal supremacy? I do not find it in the Bible. The Apostle Peter could give the Pope only what he himself possessed, and Peter possessed no temporal lordship. The Pope, argued Wickliffe, must choose between the apostleship and the kingship. If he prefers to be a king, then he can claim nothing of us in the character of an apostle. Or should he abide by his apostleship, even then he cannot claim this money, for neither Peter nor any one of the apostles ever imposed a tax upon Christians. They were supported by the free will offerings of those to whom they ministered. What England gave to the papacy, she gave not as tribute, but as alms. But alms could not be righteously demanded unless there were a real need. Was the papacy so? Were not its coffers overflowing? Was not England the poorer of the two? Her necessities were great, occasioned by a twofold drain, the exaction of the popes and the burdens of the war. Let charity then begin at home, and let England, instead of sending her money to these poor men of Avignon, who are clothed in purple and fare sumptuously every day, keep her own gold for her own uses. Thus the Reformer led his countrymen on, step by step, as they were able to follow. Chapter 8. Hierarchical persecution of Wickliffe resumed. Arrival of the Three Bulls. Wycliffe's anti-papal policy. Entirely subversive of Romanism. New citation. Appears before the bishops at Lambeth. The crowd. Its reverent behavior to Wickliffe. Message from the Queen. Dowager to the court. Dismay of bishops. They abruptly terminate the sitting. English tumults in the 14th century compared with the French Revolution in the 19th. Substance of Wycliffe's defense. The binding and loosing power. Meanwhile, the three bulls of the Pope had arrived in England. The one addressed to the king found Edward in his grave. That sent to the university was but coldly welcomed. Not in vain had Wickliffe taught so many years in its halls. Oxford, moreover, had too great a regard for its own fame to extinguish the brightest luminary it contained. But the bull addressed to the bishops found them in a different mood. Alarm and rage possessed these prelates. It was mainly by the instrumentality of Wickliffe that England had been rescued from a sheer vassalage to the papal see. It was he also that ended the papal power over benefices, thereby vindicating the independence of the English Church. He had next defended the right of the nation to dispose of its own property in defiance of the ghostly terrors by which the popes strove to divert it for their own means. Thus, guided by Wycliffe's counsel and fortified by the sanction of his name, the Parliament was adopting one bold measure after another. The penetrating genius of the man, his sterling uprightness, his cool, cautious, yet fearless courage made the humble rector of Lutterworth a formidable antagonist. Besides, his deep insight into the papal system enabled him to lead the Parliament and nation of England so that they were being drawn on unaware to deny not merely the temporal claims, but also the spiritual authority of Rome. The acts of resistance against the papal power were presumably limited to the political sphere, but they were done on principles which intruded on the spiritual authority, and could have no eventual result than the total overthrow of the whole fabric of the Roman power in England. This is what the hierarchy foresaw. The arrival of the papal bulls, therefore, was hailed by them with delight, and they lost no time in acting upon them. The primate summoned Wickliffe to appear before him in April 1378. The court was called to the Archbishop's chapel at Lambeth. The substance of the papal bulls on which the prelates acted we have reviewed in the preceding chapter. Following in the steps of the condemned heretics of ancient times, Wickliffe, said the papal missive, had not only revived their errors, but had added new ones of his own, and was to be dealt with as men deal with a common thief. The latter injunction the prelates judged it prudent not to obey. It might be safe enough to issue such an order at Avignon or at Rome, but not quite were now too numerous to attempt to seize and incarcerate Wickliffe without concern. The prelates, therefore, were content to cite and incarcerate Wickliffe without concern. The prelates, therefore, were content to cite him, in the hope that this would lead, in regular course, to the dungeon where they wished to see him immured. When the day came, a crowd quite as great as, and more friendly to the reformer than that which besieged the doors of St. Paul's on occasion of his first appearance, surrounded the palace of Lambeth. Wickliffe now stood high in popular favor as a patriot, although his claims as a theologian and reformer were not yet acknowledged, or indeed understood. Hence, this popular demonstration in his favor. To the primate, this concourse gave no assurance of a quiet termination to the trial, but Sudbury had gone too far to retreat. Wickliffe presented himself, but this time no John of Gaunt was by his side. The controversy was passing out of the political into the spiritual sphere, where the stout and valorous baron, having a salutary dread of heresy, and especially of the penalties thereto annexed, feared to follow. God was training his servant to walk alone, or rather to lean only upon himself. But at the gates of Lambeth, Wickliffe saw enough to convince him that if the barons were forsaking him, the people were coming to his side. The crowd opened reverently to permit him to pass in, and the citizens, pressing in after him, filled the chapel and testified by gestures and speeches more energetic than courtly their adherence to the cause, and their determination to stand by his champion. It seemed as if every citation of Wickliffe was destined to evoke a tempest around the judgment seat. The primate and his peers were considering how they might eject or silence the intruders, when a messenger entered, who added to their consternation. This was Sir Lewis Clifford, who had been dispatched by the Queen Mother to forbid the bishops passing sentence upon the reformer. The dismay of the prelates was complete, and the proceedings were instantly stopped. At the wind of a reed shaken, says Walsingham, who describes the scene, their speech became as soft as oil, to the public loss of their own dignity, and the damage of the whole church. They were struck with such a dread that you would think them as to be a man that heareth not, and in whose mouth are no reproofs. The only calm and self-possessed man in all that assembly was Wickliffe. A second time he returned unhurt and uncondemned from the tribunal of his powerful enemies. He had been snatched up and carried away, as it were, by a whirlwind. A formidable list of charges had been handed to Wickliffe along with his citation. It were tedious to enumerate these, nor is it necessary to go with any minuteness into the specific replies which he had prepared, and was about to read before the court when the storm broke over it, which brought its proceedings so abruptly to a close. But the substance of his defense it is important to note, because it enables us to measure the progress of the Reformer's own emancipation, and the stages of Wycliffe's enlightenment are as the stages of the Reformation. We now stand beside the cradle of Protestantism in England, and we behold the nation, roused from its deep sleep by the Reformer's voice, making its first essay to find the road of liberty. If a little noise accompanies these efforts, if crowds assemble and raise fanatical cries, and scare prelates on the judgment seat, this rudeness must be laid at the door of those who had withheld that instruction which would have taught the people to reform religion without violating the laws, and to utter their condemnation of falsehoods without indulging their passions. It would have been better that England should have lain still in her chains, than that she should disturb the repose of dignified ecclesiastics by her efforts to break them. There may be some who would have preferred the torpor of slavery, but the harmless tumults which accompanied the awakening of the English people in the 14th century are contrasted by the tragedies, the revolutions, the massacres, and the wars amid which we have seen other nations since inaugurate their liberties, which slept on while England awoke. The paper handed in by Wickliffe to his judges, stripped of its scholastic form, for after the manner of the schools it begins with a few axioms, runs out in numerous divisions, and reaches its conclusions through a long series of nice disquisitions and distinctions, is in substance as follows: that the popes have no political dominion, and that their kingdom is one of a spiritual sort only, that their spiritual authority is not absolute, so as that they may be judged of none but God. On the contrary, the Pope may fall into sin like other men, and when he does, he ought to be reproved and brought back to the path of duty by his cardinals, and if they are remiss in calling him to account, the inferior clergy and even the laity may medicinally reprove him and implead him, and reduce him to lead a better life. That the Pope has no supremacy over the temporal possessions of the clergy and the religious houses, in which some priests have vested him, the better to evade the taxes and burdens with which their sovereign, for the necessities of the state, imposes upon their temporalities. That no priest is at liberty to enforce temporal demands by spiritual censures. That the power of the priest, in absolving or condemning, is purely ministerial. That absolution will profit no one unless along with it there comes the pardon of God, nor will excommunication hurt anyone unless by sin he has exposed himself to the anger of the great judge. This last is a point on which Wickliffe often insists. It goes very deep, striking as it does at one of the main pillars on which the papal kingdom stands, and plucking from his grasp that terrible trident which enables him to govern the world, the power of anathema. On this important point, the power of the keys, as it had been technically designated, the sum of what Wickliffe taught, is expressed in his 14th article. We ought, he says, to believe that then only does a Christian priest bind or loose when he simply obeys the law of Christ, because it is not lawful for him to bind or loose but in virtue of that law, and by consequence, not unless it be in conformity to it. If Wickliffe could have dispelled belief in the Pope's binding and loosing power, he would have completely rent the fetters which chained the conscience of his nation. Knowing that the better half of his country's slavery lay in the thraldom of its conscience, Wickliffe, in setting free its soul, would virtually, by a single stroke, have achieved the emancipation of England. Chapter 9. Wycliffe's view on church property and reform. An eternal inheritance. Overgrown riches. Mort Main. Its ruinous effects. These pictured and denounced by Wickliffe. His doctrine touching ecclesiastical property. Ties. Novelty of his views. His plan of reform. How he proposed to carry it out. Rome a market. Wycliffe's independence and courage. His plan substantially proposed in Parliament after his death. Advance of England. Her exodus from the prison house. Sublimity of the spectacle. Ode of celebration. There was another matter to which Wickliffe often returned because he held it as second only in importance to the power of the keys. This was the property of the church. The church was already not only enormously rich, but she had even proclaimed a dogma which was an effectual preventative against that wealth ever being less by so much as a single penny, which secured that her accumulations should go on while the world stood. What is given to the church, said the canon law, is given to God. It is a devoted thing, consecrated and set apart forever to a holy use, and never can it be employed for any secular or worldly end whatever, and he who shall withdraw any part thereof from the church robs God and commits the awful sin of sacrilege. Over the man, whoever he might be, whether temporal baron or spiritual dignitary, who should presume to subtract so much as a single acre from her domains or a single penny from her coffers, the canon law suspended a curse. This wealth could not even be recovered. It was the church's sole, absolute, and eternal inheritance. This grievance was aggravated by the circumstance that these large possessions were exempt from taxes and public burdens. The clergy kept no connection with the country rather than to prey upon it. The Third Council of the Lateran forbade all laics, under the usual penalties, to exact any taxes from the clergy, or lay any contributions upon them or their churches. If, however, the necessities of the state were great, and the lands of the laity insufficient, the priests might, of their own good pleasure, grant a voluntary subsidy. The Fourth General Council of Lateran renewed this canon, hurling excommunication against all who should disregard it, but graciously permitting the clergy to aid in the exigencies of the state if they saw fit, and the Pope were willing. Here was a kingdom of priests, the owners of half of the soil, every inch of which was enclosed within a sacred rail, so that no one durst lay a finger upon it, unless indeed their forehead head, the pontiff, should first give his counsel. In these overgrown riches, Wickliffe discerned the source of innumerable evils. The nation was being beggared, and the government was being weakened. The lands of the church were continually growing wider, and the area which supported the burdens of the state and furnished the revenue of the crown was constantly growing narrower. Nor was the possession of this wealth less hurtful to the corporation that owned it than its abstraction was to that from whom it had been torn. Whence flowed the many corruptions of the state, the pride, the luxury, the indolence of churchmen, manifestly from these enormous riches. Sacred uses, so it was pleaded. The more that wealth increased, the less sacred the uses to which it was devoted, and the more flagrant the neglect of the duties which those who possessed it were appointed to discharge. But Wycliffe's own words will best convey to us an idea of his feelings on this point, and the height to which the evil had grown. Prelates and priests, says he, cry aloud and write that the king hath no jurisdiction or power over the persons and goods of Holy Church. And when the king and the secular lords, perceiving that their ancestors' alms are wasted in pomp and pride, gluttony and other vanities, wish to take again the excess of temporal goods, and to help the land and themselves and their tenants, these worldly clerks brawl loudly that they ought to be cursed for intromitting with the goods of Holy Church, as if secular lords and commons were no part of Holy Church. And again, he complains that property which was not too holy to be spent in gluttony and other vanities, was yet accounted too holy to bear the burdens of the state, and to contribute to the defense of the realm. By their new law of decretos, says he, they have ordained that our clergy shall pay no subsidy nor tax for keeping of our king and realm, without leave and assent of the worldly priest of Rome. And yet many times this proud worldly priest is an enemy of our land, and secretly maintains our enemies in war against us with our own gold, and thus they make an alien priest, and he, the proudest of all the priests, to be the chief lord of the whole of the goods which clerks possess in the realm, and that is the greatest part thereof. Wickliffe was not a mere corrector of abuses. He was a reformer of institutions, and accordingly he laid down a principle which menaced the very foundations of this great evil. Those acres, now covering half the face of England, those cathedral and convent buildings, those tithes and revenues which constitute the goods of the church, are not, Wickliffe affirmed, in any legal or strict sense, the church's property. She neither bought it, nor did she win it by service in the field, nor did she receive it as a feudal, unconditional gift. It is the alms of the English nation. The church is but the administrator of this property. The nation is the real proprietor, and the nation is bound through the king and parliament, its representatives, to see that the church devotes this wealth to the objects for which it was given. And if it shall find that it is abused or diverted to other objects, it may recall it. The ecclesiastic who becomes immoral and fails to fulfill the duties of his office forfeits that office with all its temporalities. And the same law, which applies to the individual, applies to the whole corporation or church. Such, in brief, was the doctrine of Wickliffe. But further reformer distinguished between the lands of the abbacy or the monastery and the acres of the neighboring baron. The first were national property, the second were private. The first were held for spiritual uses, the second for secular, and by how much the issues depending on the right use of the first, as regarded both the temporal and eternal interests of mankind, exceeding those depending on the right use of the second. By so much was the nation bound closely to observe and jealously to guard against all perversion and abuse in the case of the former. The baron might feast, hunt, and ride out attended by ever so many men at arms. He might pass his days in labor or in idleness, just as suited him. But the bishop must eschew these delights and worldly vanities. He must give himself to reading, to prayer, to the ministry of the word. He must instruct the ignorant and visit the sick, and approve himself in all things as a faithful minister of Jesus Christ. But while Wickliffe made this most important distinguished between ecclesiastical and lay property, he held that as regarded the imposts of the king, the estates of the bishop and the estates of the baron were on a level. The sovereign had as good a right to tax the one as the other, and both were equally bound to bear their fair share of the expense of defending the country. Further, Wycliffe held the decision of the king in all questions touching ecclesiastical property to be final. And let no one, said the reformer in effect, be afraid to embrace these opinions, or to be deterred from acting on them by terror of papal censure. The pretended spiritual thunder hurts no one whose cause is good. Even tithes could not now be claimed, Wycliffe held, on a divine authority. The tenth of all that the soil yielded was, by God's command, set apart for the support of the church under the economy of Moses. But that enactment, the reformer taught, was no longer binding. The ritual and the polity of that dispensation had passed away, and only the moral remained. And that moral Wycliffe summoned up in the words of the apostle, "Let him that is taught in the word minister to him that teacheth in all good things." And while strenuously insisting on the duty of the instructed to provide for their spiritual teachers, he did not hesitate to avow that where the priest notoriously failed in his office, the people were under no obligation to support him, and if he should seek by the promise of paradise or threat of an anathema to extort a livelihood for work which he did not do, and from men whom he never taught, they were to hold the promise and the threat alike as empty and futile. True men say, wrote Wycliffe, that prelates are more bound to preach truly the gospel than their subjects are to pay them tithes. For God chargeth that no more. For God chargeth that more, and it is more profitable to both parties. Prelates, therefore, are more accursed who cease from their preaching than are the subjects who cease to pay their tithes, even while their prelates do their office well. These were novel and startling opinions in the age of Wycliffe. It required no ordinary independence of mind to embrace such views. They were at war with the maxims of the age. They were opposed to the opinions of which the church and state had acted for 1,000 years, and they went to the raising of the whole ecclesiastical settlement of Christendom. If they were to be applied, all existing religious institutions must be remodeled. But if true, why should they not be carried out? Wycliffe did not shrink from even this responsibility. He proposed, and not only did he propose, he earnestly pleaded with the king and parliament that the whole ecclesiastical estate should be reformed in accordance with the principles he had enunciated. Let the church surrender all her possessions, her broad acres and palatial buildings, her tithes, her multitude dues, and return to the simplicity of early days, and depend only on the free will offerings of the people, as did the apostles and first preachers of the gospel. Such was the plan Wycliffe laid before the men of the 14th century. We may well imagine the amazement of those that heard his words. Did Wycliffe really indulge the hope that his scheme would be carried into effect? Did he really think that powerful abbots and wealthy prelates would sacrifice their principalities, their estates and honors at the call of duty, and exchanging riches for dependence and luxurious ease for labor, go forth to instruct the poor and ignorant as humble ministers of the gospel? There was not faith in the world for such an act of self-denial. Had it been realized, it would have been one of the most marvelous things in all history. Nor did Wycliffe himself expected to happen. He knew too well the ecclesiastics of his time, and the avarice and pride that animated them, from their head at Avignon down to the barefooted mendicant of England, to look for such a miracle. But his duty was not to be measured by his chance of success. Reform was needed. It must be attempted if church and state were to be saved. And here was the reform which stood enjoined, as he believed, in the Scriptures, and which the example of Christ and his apostles confirmed and sanctioned. And though it was a sweeping and comprehensive one, reversing the practice of 1,000 years, condemning the maxims of past ages, and necessarily provoking the hostility of the wealthiest and most powerful body in Christendom, yet he believed it to be practicable if men had only virtue and courage enough. Above all, he believed it to be sound, and the only reform that would meet the evil, and therefore, though princes were forsaking him, and popes were fulminating against him, and bishops were summoning him to their bar, he fearlessly did his duty by opening his plan of reform in all its breadth before the eyes of the nation, and laying it at the foot of the throne. But Wycliffe, a man of action as well as of thought, did not aim at carrying this revolution by a stroke. All great changes, he knew, must proceed gradually. What he proposed was that as benefices fell vacant, that new appointments should convey no right to the temporalities, and thus in short time, without injury or hardship to any one, the whole face of England would be changed. It is well known, says he, that the King of England, in virtue of his regalia, on the death of a bishop or abbot, or anyone possessing large endowments, takes possession of these endowments as the sovereign, and that a new election is not entered upon without new assent. Nor will the temporalities in such a case pass from their last occupant to his successor without that assent. Let the king therefore refuse to continue what has been the great delinquency of his predecessors, and in a short time the whole kingdom will be freed from the mischiefs which have flowed from this source. It may be perhaps objected that thus to deprive the church of her property was to injure vitally the interests of religion and civilization. With the abstract question we have here nothing to do, let us look at the matter practically, and as it must have presented itself to Wickliffe. The withdrawal of the church's property from the service of religion was already all but complete, so far as concerned the religious instruction and the spiritual interests of the nation. This wealth profited about as little as if it did not exist at all. It served but to maintain the pomp of the higher clergy and the excesses which reigned in the religious houses. The question then practically was not, shall this property be withdrawn from religious uses, but shall it be withdrawn from its actual uses, which certainly are not religious, and be devoted to other objects more profitable to the commonwealth. On that point Wycliffe had a clear opinion. He saw a better way of supporting the clergy, and he could not, he thought, devise a worse than the existing one. It is thus, he says, that the wretched beings of this world are estranged from the faith, and hope, and charity, and become corrupt in heresy and blasphemy, even worse than heathens. Thus it is that a clerk, a mere collector of pence, who can neither read nor understand a verse in his psalter, nor repeat the commandments of God, bringeth forth a bull of lead, testifying in opposition to the doom of God, and of manifest experience, that he is able to govern many souls. And to act upon this false bull, he will incur costs and labor, and often fight, and get fees, and give much gold out of our land to aliens and enemies. And many are thereby slaughtered by the hand of our enemies, to their comfort and our confusion. Elsewhere he describes Rome as a market, where the cure of souls was openly sold, and where Whoever offered the highest price got the fattest benefice. In that market, virtue, piety, learning were naught. The only coin current was gold. But the men who trafficked there and came back invested with a spiritual office, he thus describes, as much therefore as God's word and the bliss of heaven in the souls of men are better than earthly goods, so much are these worldly prelates, who withdraw the great debt of holy teaching, worse than thieves, more accursedly sacrilegious than ordinary plunderers, who break into churches and steal thence chalices and vestments, and never so much gold. Whatever may be the reader's judgment of the sentiments of Wickliffe on this point, there can be but one opinion touching his independence of mind, and his fidelity to what he believed to be the truth. Looking back on history, and looking around in the world, he could see only a unanimous dissent from his doctrine. All the ages were against him. All the institutions of Christendom were against him. The Bible only, he believed, was with him. Supported by it, he bravely held and avowed his opinion. His peril was great, for he had made the whole hierarchy of Christendom his enemy. He had especially provoked the wrath of that spiritual potentate whom few kings in that age could brave with impunity. But he saw by faith him who is invisible, and therefore he feared not Gregory. The evil this wealth was doing, the disorders and weakness with which it was afflicting the state, the immorality and ignorance with which it was corrupting society, and the eternal ruin in which it was plunging the souls of men, deeply affected him. And though the riches he so earnestly entreated men to surrender had been 1,000,000 times more than they were, reformers seemed so very extravagant. Doubtless the mere mention of it took away the breath from those who had touched this gold. But the more sober and thoughtful of the nation began to see that nor even to the men of his own time did the measure of the reformers seem so very extravagant. Doubtless the mere mention of it took away the breath from those who had touched this gold. But the more sober and thoughtful of the nation began to see that it was not as impracticable as it looked, and that instead of involving the destruction, it was more likely to be the saving of the institutions of learning and religion. About 24 years after the Reformer's death, a great measure of church reform, based on the views of Wycliffe, was proposed by the Commons. The plan took shape in a petition which Parliament presented to the King, and which was to the following effect: that the Crown should take possession of all the property of the Church, that it should appoint a body of clergy, 15,000 in number, for the religious service of the kingdom, that it should assign an annual stipend to each, and that the surplus of the ecclesiastical property should be devoted to a variety of state purposes, of which the building and support of almshouses was one. Those who had the power could not or would not see the wisdom of the reformer. Those who did see it had not the power to act upon it. And so the wealth of the church remained untouched, and remained untouched, it continued to grow, and along with it all the evils it engendered, until at last these were no longer bearable. Then even papal governments recognized the wisdom of Wycliffe's words, and began to act upon his plan. In Germany, under the Treaty of Westphalia, in Holland, and in our own country, many of the richest benefices were secularized. When, at a later period, most of the Catholic monarchies suppressed the Jesuits, the wealth of that opulent body was seized by the sovereign. In these memorable examples, we discover no trace of property, but simply the resumption by the state of the salaries of its public servants, when it deemed their services or the mode of them no longer useful. These examples are the best testimony to the substantial soundness of Wycliffe's views, and the more we contemplate the times in which he formed them, the more we are amazed at the sagacity, the comprehensiveness, the courage, and the faith of the reformer. And that's where we're going to pick up next time when we continue. I've run out of time. Well, I thank you all for suffering with me through this today. I hope it has been instructive. I found it very instructive and gives me insight as to when the real Reformation started, long before the 95 Thesis was nailed to the door of the church at Wittenberg, long before that. Well, may the Almighty bless you all and keep you as you travel on the narrow way that leads to life. I love you all, and I will see you next time.